Hello there and welcome to the Card Grotto. Today I'm talking about my top 10 most inexpensive craft supplies that I reach for the most. This is a collaboration with Justine Hovey and she will be talking about her top 10 favourites and I will be talking about my top 10 favourites, and I will have a link to her video in the description box. So first of all I'm going to talk about stencils. I have listed some of the prices on the screen there for the kind of average price of the stencils, but do bear in mind this is dependent on where you live and which shop you purchase from and things like that, and different brands. But I absolutely love stencils. They last forever as long as you don't abuse them too much. There are lots of different ones that you can purchase, like edges, like clouds, and ones like this that cover a whole card base. There are also ones that are kind of like what I sort of say is a 3 for 2. So you've got the two edges there, and in the middle you've got the grass there, which is, I find these ones in particular really good value for money because you can do lots of different things with them. There are also layering stencils, which are a little bit more of a higher price point, but if you purchase them obviously together because they come together, they are a bit less expensive than if you were to purchase two separate stencils, if that makes sense. So I really love these ones in particular from Studio Katia, the kind of balloon ones. And like I said, I love stencils because you can use them for lots of different things, but I do find that one of the techniques that I think most people forget about that you can do with stencils is to dry emboss with them. So I'm just showing you here that I'm running this through my Platinum 6 die cutting machine with an embossing mat, and it's going to emboss the shape of the stencil onto the cardstock. I apologise that it is difficult to see here on camera, but hopefully you can see that just about enough, that it has actually embossed that, and I find that's a really nice way to be able to get some detail, especially onto clean and simple cards. But it also works really nicely to then do other stuff on top. So like here I'm doing some ink blending on top of the dry embossing. And the dry embossing just helps it stand out a bit more. But you could spray through this, you could use texture paste. Stencils are just so versatile, I think. So moving on to shimmer spray, and this is the Tsukineko Sheer Shimmer Spritz, and this is in Sparkle. This is a really pretty shimmer spray because it's quite subtle, although it's very, very sparkly at the same time. And I find that pretty much, if I'm going to want sparkle on a card, I'm pretty much just going to want to have clear sparkle and just use the colour that's underneath already on my panel to add the colour. So I find that it's a bit more of an inexpensive way just to have a clear shimmer spritz, and then you can use that on top of lots of different colours. It is very difficult to see here on camera. I'm just using my torch here on my phone to be able to show you that sparkle. It's really very pretty in real life, and like I said, more inexpensive just to have the one shimmer spray or the sparkly shimmer spray. Next up are placemats, and these are reusable placemats, and these particular ones are made from plastic, but you could use ones made from anything as long as they're kind of wipeable. I quite like to keep mine as clean as possible, but I'll share with you in a minute. One of them that I've used alcohol ink on is really not very clean at all, but because they're so inexpensive, these were about £1 from my local grocery shop. And it doesn't really matter if they get beat up or anything like that because they're so inexpensive. I can just keep them forever. But what I tend to use them for is just to place things on it that I want to dry, so I can move these about. There are obviously lots of different things that you can do for that, but I find these placemats inexpensive. Next up are white gel pens. I really love these white gel pens for adding detail onto stamped images. I do find that they are a bit more value for money if you purchase them as a 3-pack rather than purchasing them separately, if you happen to want all of the sizes in the 3-pack. So this pack here comes with the size 10, which is the one I'm using here, which is like a really bold, it's very opaque as you can see, which is nice. Next up is the 08, which is a bit of a finer line, but again still quite opaque, and this is the one that I tend to use the most. But there are also the 05, which is very thin, but as you can see it is quite a lot less opaque, but I do like to use all three for different things. What I tend to use them for the most is to add highlights onto stamped images. I also quite like to add dots and things like that with these. I find that it's quite an inexpensive way to be able to add detail onto stamped images, and you can also use them to erase mistakes as well. Next up are non-craft branded tweezers. So I use tweezers all of the time when I'm card making. I don't have long nails, so I do find it quite difficult to be able to take the backings off of foam tape, for example, or double-sided tape. I also use them quite a bit to be able to place things down. So like images, for example, that I've stamped and cut out, like this little hedgehog here. Say I want to place it down onto a card base, I often use tweezers to be able to do that, and for sentiment strips and things like that. I find that these tweezers in particular that I have here, these are from a local chemist and they're more for the cosmetic market, but they're really inexpensive. These are like the cheapest cosmetic tweezers that you can personally buy, but I find that they work really well for this particular way of using them, and it doesn't matter if they get sort of covered in glue or anything like that, I can just clean them really easily. So next up is Memo tape, and I find that this Memo tape, this one here is from Heffy Doodle, but you could probably purchase it even cheaper from Amazon or eBay, for example. But I like Memo tape because it's quite low tack, and this Memo tape in particular is quite a bit cheaper than post-it tape. Now don't get me wrong, I do still use post-it tape, but if I'm going to be using it and I'm going to use quite a lot of it, I tend to use this to save me a bit of money for not using the post-it tape. And so I use it quite often if I want to mask off an area on a card base, for example, if I'm doing some ink blending. And so it gives me quite a nice crisp line there with the ink blending above it. But you can also use it for masking off images with stamping. So what you need to do for that is to just ink up your stamp here, stamp it onto the tape, and you can reuse this tape. As you can see, I'm using it now for masking, whereas I was using it for masking but with ink blending. So you can definitely use this tape quite a bit. I'm just going to cut that out with scissors, and then I'm going to stamp my image down onto some cardstock as well, cover it over with the mask that I have made from the Memo tape, just placing that over the top. And then I could do all sorts here. I could do ink blending over the top, but I am just going to do some extra stamping here just to stamp a couple of the other little turtles here next to each other. And once I remove that masking, or the Memo tape I should say, from the middle, you'll see that that one is in front of the other ones. So it's really helpful to be able to use for that, and it's probably a bit cheaper than traditional mask paper. Next up is Nuvo Crystal Glaze. I really like this to add again some detail onto stamped images. I particularly like this one from Tonic because it comes out of the bottle quite easily. I'm classing it as fairly inexpensive purely because this is going to last you absolutely ages. This bottle has lasted me ages. I've had no clogging with it at all, no problems at all, so it has lasted me a very long time already, and there's still tons in the bottle. You can obviously use it here like I'm doing to add lines, or you could add dots. You could use that as kind of like homemade embellishments, but what I generally like to use it for is if I'm adding detail to stamped images for anything that I want to be shiny. So for this example, I quite like to use it on balloons. If I get an air bubble in it, I just try and take that out with a kind of craft pick or something like that. Usually it's a bit quicker than this, but because I was on video, of course, it took me some time, but I got there in the end, and it just gives a really nice sort of shine to stamped images. And you can add a couple of layers to this as well if you wanted to, and let them dry in between. But like I said, I find that it's just a nice way to add some detail onto images in particular. So next up are loose embellishments. I find that purchasing embellishments in bags and things like this is quite a bit cheaper than purchasing them with the adhesive already on the backs of them. I do really like to purchase clear ones in particular because I find that I get the most value for money out of these, because I can use them on pretty much any card. Because they're clear, they work really well with lots of different colours and designs and things like that. You can add colour to these with Copic markers and things like that. I have done that in the past, but to be honest with you, most of the time I really like to use the clear embellishments. You do get a lot of different sizes in a pack for the most part, especially these ones from Little Things from Lucy's cards. And here I'm just showing you an example of how I've used them, just to add a slight detail onto a clean and simple card. I've added one of the little jewels into the bow of the kitty's hair, and just gives some really nice sparkle. And as you can see, the colour works really nicely because they are clear. Like I said, it works well with any sort of colour. Next up, you need to be able to pick up those jewels. So for this, I've picked the jewel picker from MARVY. I think out of any of the kind of wands, embellishment wands, I think this is probably the most inexpensive. You have two different ends to this, a thin one and a thicker one. And they do have caps on those as well, so that they don't get dusty, which is really nice. There's kind of like a plastic covering to the tips, and that's what the tackiness is. I do find that occasionally it does lose its tackiness, in which case I just run it under some water and it tends to bring the tackiness back, or kind of dab it on the side of my stamp chamois or something like that that's a little bit wet. But I find that both ends work really nicely. They pick up the embellishments really well, and then they also do kind of release them really well as well, which is always important. And then last but not least is embossing powder. I find that embossing powder not only is pretty inexpensive to purchase, it lasts a very, very long time. I've had tubs of embossing powder that I've had for years upon years. I use them quite a lot for embossing sentiments in particular, but one of my favourite techniques with embossing powder is to do emboss resist. And for that, I'm just going to show you quickly how I do it. I have a background stamp here that I'm inking up with Versamark ink. I've prepped my cardstock with an anti-static powder tool, and then I'm just placing that onto the stamp and using my fingers there just to press that ink into the cardstock. I'm then going to apply the embossing powder. I do find that although I've had a lot of embossing powder for a long time, it does go stale, so do be aware that if you're not getting the results you want to, it may be because the embossing powder's gone bad and you may need to replace that embossing powder. But for the most part, they do last quite a long time. I'm just using a coffee filter there just to grab any excess, and then I can funnel that back into the jar. And then with actually applying the heat to the embossing powder, I like to get my heat tool quite hot before I bring it to the cardstock, and then for the most part I heat from the back until the embossing powder looks like it's just about to melt, and then I heat it from the front. And I find that way that I get less sort of graininess, and often I find that if I've got graininess, it's because I've overheated the embossing powder. So doing it from the back I find works really quite well. So that's just a tip if you have any problems with using embossing powder and heating it. But I find that embossing powder is a really inexpensive way to be able to add some technique onto your cards. So I'm just using a blending brush here and added some ink on top, and as you can see, the embossing powder is resisting that ink. And then I'm just going to go in with a dry cloth just to remove any ink off of that embossing powder. And you can do this technique with stencils as well, and just pounce the Versamark ink through the stencil. So that was a look at my top 10 most inexpensive craft supplies that I reach for the most. I will have links to the products that I shared in the description bar on YouTube and also over on my blog. And I will have a link to Justine's video in the description bar as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.